Gosh, I didn't mean for that to happen. Ahead and get started here. Thank you all so much for joining. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time today. This is Bethany Moffett. I am with the Insights Association, and I really appreciate you joining me today. We are very happy to have you all join us. I am Bethany Moffett. As I mentioned, I'm on the board of the Insights Association Southwest chapter. We're very excited that you've all come and join us for today's session. This was actually going to be an in-person event in Salt Lake City. We were very excited to host a small networking and learning-ship opportunity for our members in that area. But with the sheltering in place and the scenario where we are not able to join in mass, we have made this a webinar. And we're excited to have you all join us today. Thank you so much to Focus Vision for sponsoring this event. We will reschedule the in-person event for later sometime this year once things open up a little bit, but thank you so much to Focus Vision. It's with sponsorship companies like Focus Vision that really allow me and the rest of the board to keep up on our commitment of bringing ongoing training and education to our members. So thank you so much, Focus Vision. If anyone on the call would like to volunteer for the chapter or would be interested in becoming a sponsor for the chapter and some of the events that we do throughout the year, please reach out anytime. We would love to hear from you. Our next event will actually be in our quarterly webinar series. Our summer webinar will be June 17th. We will have Sam Herzog from Gongos Research come talk to us about creating communications for impact. You should be receiving information for registering for that event in your inboxes over the next couple of days, but please save the date for June 17th. Today, we are all here. I'm pleased to introduce to you all to Kate Riley. Kate is with Braintrace as the Director of Information Security and Compliance. Kate brings over 20 years of experience in assessment of internal control, security governance, framework development, and risk management programs. She's very skilled in leading teams to define control structures, development of control and compensating controls, as well as how management can control and sustain governance programs. As we all know, governance is continuing to really direct what we do in the research space. So Kate has a lot of knowledge that she can bring. She's developed and implemented security frameworks such as ISO, Corbett, NIST, and obviously the compliance reviews such as FFIEC, HIPAA, SOX, FedRAMP, GDPR, GLBA, and I'm sure there will be more to come. She has held roles both internationally and for doing both international and external audits, as well as regulatory oversight. Her background includes healthcare, higher education, financial services, manufacturing, technology, insurance, real estate. She's performed state and federal reviews and has worked with a wide range of firms from single entrepreneurial companies to international conglomerates. Katie is here to talk to us today about the use of blockchain and cybersecurity controls as it applies to current businesses models and how those applications of blockchain capabilities might become leveraged into businesses and the research that they do. And then building off the current understanding and uses of blockchain, Kate will really explore with us how blockchain impacts how businesses use it, not just for cryptocurrency, but really for security within their businesses, and specifically businesses that uses things like databases or supply chain management. And while she isn't a researcher, she definitely is able to give us a great overview and delves into the differences between security and blockchain and how each can be appropriately leveraged to unharness consumers and businesses alike. Her presentation will last about 40 minutes today. Then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes worth of questions, and we'll conclude about 5 minutes to the hour so that folks can get on to their next Zoom call. I'm sure that everyone is very busy today, full of calls, but there's a lot of information to cover here. So if you have questions during the presentation, if you want to go ahead and use your chat functionality and send them over, we'll answer all questions at the end. Of course, we'll open it up at the end as well. So if you want to save your questions to the end, that's perfectly fine as well. So with that, Kate, I am going going to give you control, and you will have the ability to show your screen. Let's make sure you can pick that up. All right, we see your screen.
All right, let's make sure we see the screen that I want you to see.
We see your backdrop, the beautiful mountains.
Let's try this one. Do you see the presentation now?
We do. We see it in the presenter mode with both of the, not the presenter mode, but not the presentation mode, but the presenter mode, to where we see 2 screens.
Now we should see.
There we go. Now it's the full. Yes, ma'am, you got it. All right, I think we are in good shape.
So I appreciate that. So welcome everyone. As Bethany described, today we're going to go through just building some foundation concepts together. So we're going to kind of take the mystique out of what is the block and blockchain, what are chains activities, and how they connect together and are secured, because that functionality brings us the insight into broader applications and what we're probably most comfortable with, which is Bitcoin. And then, because I want to get to an apples to apples comparison, we're going to pivot over and see how cybersecurity, the cyber in cybersecurity is electronic data. So there's a lot of commonalities in blockchain and cybersecurity. And the reason we're doing that is so that we can understand how businesses are functioning in the current world of cybersecurity. And then, because we built that foundation in blocks and blockchains, we can start to see the application of a blockchain to different kinds of business models. And I appreciate that most of this audiences are researchers. And so as I go through this, I do try to bring it back into some of that research culture, but that's the advantage at the end of this. So holding those questions until the end, if I haven't kind of built in that concept, let's tackle that at the end. So I'm very excited for that. So let's just do this. So what is the block in blockchain? Really, a block is a piece of data. It's data inside a format. Let's take the Bitcoin thing and say we have a wallet. That's the block. And then the data in the wallet would be the coins. So we see that a block is on a shared network. It's got a transaction to every activity in that wallet. If you think about it, that's the distributed ledger, that chronological chains of events that happened based on the activity to that data. It's encrypted. What we like about this is that the data has a security applied to the block itself. It's encrypted data. And then the use of that shared network and the use of those blocks in the network functionality is that everybody on that network has equal visibility into that block and that ledger. And the reason for that is that you take away sort of a subjective nature of using this data, and you have a objective nature of using it. And of course, Bitcoin makes the most sense for that, right? We all agree what a coin is, the value of the coin. Everybody can see the coin. We all agree that that's the activity of that coin. And that brings us to how that block is sort of saved and stored on that shared network, is that it's got this irrefutable history, this chain of activities on this block, and they're encrypted and they're written and they're locked, so that it is done and done. Now, the chain part of the blockchain is really looking at how do we kind of bring that ledger into the block history. And so to do that, it's a common trusted network for our current example. And the trust in that network is how every node attached to that network is doing a job. Now, a node attached to a network is like a server. That's the node. It's got computing power, and its one job on that network might be to do the validation, or what we know in our Bitcoin world, mining. And I'll get into what that is exactly. But if we think about it, you've got consumers on that network and some computing power attached to the network that its own job is to be a validator of the network activity. So how does that work? It works because when we put data in that block, it's a known data amount. And you think of bits and bytes and you add them up, and you can, figure out how big that block of data is. That gives us a value. And what's so smart about that value of that block of data is that everybody can agree using the same algorithms, the same computing power, on how big that block is. And that's how that trusted network is so ingenious. You've got all of these independent computing powers all over the world in the case of some of these blockchain networks. networks, and they node all over the world is just their job is, what is that block? What was the chain activity? And they're doing that computation. And when you have a consensus on that network that the computation values are all the same, it is encrypted, it is written, and it becomes the chain activity on that block of information. And so the distribution of that network is part of that kind of pliable functionality. And the way that that mining happens and the validation happens becomes that really smart agreement on the activity that's happening in that block of information. And the other nice part about that is that, you're not depending on one computing power to do the work or two or three. It's very independent. So as you build that trusted network, you build it in with having a lot of validators doing that. Okay, so what I want to take a time now is show us where blockchain is actually used today, because we actually have a lot of examples of blockchain being in use. And the first example here is digital identity. So let's just start with what we know. In the United States, we've got a federal government, and every resident or citizen of the United States has a social security number. And we also have other key identity about us. We have a birth certificate, and we might have other identifiers, like we might have marriage certificates, and we might have children so we have dependents. And so you can see where in a database in our current model, we've got all this data in there. You just take that to the blockchain network and it still translates. And so we do see digital identities being in use today. And one example of that is the state of Iowa. The state of Iowa has adopted blockchain, and they want to be known for being the blockchain state. So you can incorporate your business in the state of Iowa, and that's how you start to set up your part of their shared network, and the digital identity of your corporation is part of how you authenticate and authorize for other transactions happening with other municipalities like water, gas, electric, and even businesses using a very similar model on how transactions are occurring. So the block of data would be your resident. And the unique identifiers of that is that block, is that block, is that block. It's not a shared block. It's not moved or transmuted in any way. And that's the genius of it. So then the transactions or the chain activities on that block of data can be reflective. Like I said, you can have a child birth, so then you change the data in that block about me, and it shows that I have how many children. And you might say that, let's say I get divorced, so then you have a chain of the data on my identity that changes maybe my name, and it might change my address or other key identifiers about me. So digital identity is starting to make sense on a very national level, even on a statewide level or a regional level, when you've got a commonality about how you're using identity to do other transactions. Our next example is in voting. Again, state of Iowa is being a really great example of that. And they are using this public and private key functionality that blockchain does. So as you can imagine, a candidate has a public key. There's a block of data that maybe has their photo on it, and it's their name and their key unique identifiers, and it's public. Everybody should know all of the candidates. And then when I log into this voting shared blockchain network, I come with my unique identity. And you think about it, it's a block for me, and it's got a finite number of data for me, and I can only use my data one time. That's the validation on this network about known sizes of data. It's my unique data block, and when I cast my vote, I apply my private key to that candidate, and it sends my confirmation of the vote to that candidate, and all the validators on the network all agree that my one vote has been cast. I can't go in and log in again. I can't, delete my browser history and try it again, because this shared network has all of that independent validation going on. So it allows for you not to have voting fraud. And the way that I have my private key set up is, of course, how you get added onto that shared network is assigning of the private key so that that one user can only do one thing. And then you realize that once I've cast my vote, if you will, my wallet is empty and it's closed down, so I can't reapply it again. Then we get into smart contracts, and what we like about our smartphones, right, and smart cars, it's kind of the same concept when we talk about blockchain. And the smart contract part here is, again, a block of data, and you can have conditions in that data that allow for a next level of activity to happen. Now, we see this in our current world. We're very familiar with how smart contracts work. Think of the stock exchange, where a stock has a criteria set up on conditions. When a certain stock gets to a certain value point, you either buy or sell or freeze. And those are the conditions that are digitally defined based on behaviors. And that works the very same way in a smart contract, where you set up, again, a shared network. We all agree what the blocks of data are, and you can have public and private blocks, right? So that you've got that transaction capability in it. And then you can identify the conditions in that block, such as, the send request for funds, and when funds are released, then that has been received and validated. Then you ship the goods, or you open up the door, or you do something else that's related to the condition in that smart contract. And that leads us to what smart property is. And it's very similar to that. As you can imagine, it's again a shared network. Blocks of data are related to the asset, and you have conditions in that asset for how it moves forward into the next part of the contract of there. So let's just take that into a hotel. Some hotels are actually using blockchain. Every room in the hotel is a block of data. And when I want to reserve a room at that hotel, I'm on their shared website, and I identify a request for 2 nights, and then I identify the block of rooms that are available. I pick my room, I pick my block, and then I do a request for the room availability. They send a request for the payment. When the repayment is received and processed, those rooms become available to me. And how that would work is that you get a code, like a smartphone, that I would either punch into the door, or some of your smartphones have a badge that would open up the door. Now, as you can imagine, if I don't request 2 more nights in that same room, when I go in to put in my code or show my badge, it won't work. And so it's reflecting what we do in a physical world, but just in that blockchain network functionality. The other kinds of ideas out there with smart property, we see with driverless cars, right? They're very smart. They're all connected up to a shared network, and it's all managed because each vehicle is a block. And you could see, excuse me, where the information on that vehicle is tracked. Those chain of activities are tracked, such as I buy the car, and then if I have to register it. So you could see, again, that digital identity being that I've registered my car with my state Department of Vehicle. I've registered my driver's license there, so that's part of my identity, the registration of the car itself, and of course, insurance on the car. And then you could see the connectivity of that device, where if my lapse in my car insurance, then my car could give me that indicator, like it's going to expire in 5 days, and if I don't renew, then the car actually stops working for me. So smart property is actually getting a lot of use for blockchain functionality, and as you can imagine, the simplicity of that becomes one of those advantages where you can do a little bit tighter asset management, you can control the use of assets. And then our last one is really asset tracking. So when we look at asset tracking, what you're seeing here is a supply chain process where you've got the origin, maybe the raw materials, and then of course the chain of activities connects to that smart contract idea, these conditions. When you have a batch of, in this case, diamonds are using blockchain literally right now. So when you have a batch of mined raw diamonds, and then the transactions are chained to that actual raw diamond. So it's got a unique identifier, and you can see the activities that go through that supply chain management until you've sort of chopped them up and made them materials to be purchased, and then turn into jewels of some sort. And then you've got distributors that would purchase that batch and be able then to distribute it at their local stores. Now, what we know about the diamond industry is that they have a lot of regulatory oversight requirements to ensure that you've got labor that is fairly paid and fairly treated, right? That blood diamond part of it is just that slave labor. We've got other assets that are commodities, really, when you look at it this way, that have the same requirements. So coffee, right? And we've got requirements about organically grown coffee. What's the criteria or condition for that? And cotton and garments, and certain commodities that not only how did you source it, but how was the sourcing generated throughout its life cycle until it became the product that you are buying. And organizations today are having more and more regulatory oversight for them to prove that supply chain origin management of it. And so when you get to a blockchain concept, it's transparent. Everybody can see the transaction history on the chain according to that block of data. And then you start to realize how you can use some of that with the public and private key so that certain roles on that network have full transparency and others are just using that for the transaction capability, right? Purchasing or sending a request or creating it. So now we're just going to segue really quickly to connect to what is security around the blockchain. And so it's not new. It's not this, wow, somebody invented something really crazy here. No, blockchain security is cryptographic techniques, mathematical models of behavior and decision making. We already see this, like I said, in current models today, the stock market, even with the smart cars, and of course, encryption in our current systems and databases. So there's nothing new here, right? But why do we like blockchain? We like it for that durability. You've got decentralized network where people all over that network are not dependent on one single node, one single subjective person saying you are granted or not granted, this is authorized or not. That durability is, if not all those validating nodes want to work today, doesn't stop the process from happening. It has that durability. And the transparency, each node on the network has an identical copy of the blockchain. So everybody is seeing the same thing all the time. That transparency means you don't have to do security through what we call obscurity. No, it means it's intended to be seen and validated. And so that's the job. And so when you have that transparency, you don't have to do layers and layers and layers to prevent people from knowing what kind of validation is happening, who did it, and if it was consistent or not. It's really everybody doing the same thing. It's not everybody doing some part of something. It's a validating node is a validating node, and that's all it is computing power. And then we like the process integrity and the consensus on the network. One of the advantages of that, if we think about some of that supply chain, is that when you have data on the blockchain, that block of data is calculated, it becomes a mathematical component, right? It is what it is. And the contract to buy, sell, or add, or change something is what it is. And these become data values. And so you end up with this validating capability in a mathematical world that can build consensus on, we all agree that that hash total is that hash total. And you can't go back and modify a chain that was already written and encrypted. You can't modify it. So it gives you that integrity about, yeah, that was sourced from that mountain, and the HR and the people that were there was validated, and then the data of how the big block of diamonds was chopped up, and that was validated. And so we're all witnessing in a digital world what's happening in a physical world. But the ability of those nodes to actually do that independent of each other creates a trust, if you will, and integrity about how that happens. We love trust, we love the reliability of it. And then the last thing we really super like about the blockchain is what we call immutability. And that means that, it's set in stone, it's encrypted, it's written, and you can't alter it. You can't go back and modify a record. If we think of where fraud is today in our current business model, it's all about cooking the books, right? Having a duplicate copy or erasing a part of a copy or going back in history and, changing what happened or maybe erasing what happened. But when you get to blockchain, it has this nice sticky resonance. So, everybody agrees on the block, everybody has consensus on the validation, the chain is written and encrypted, and then it's done, it's set in stone, you can't modify it. And so it has this nice transaction that is what it is. From an internal and external audit standpoint, that's a lot of what auditors are looking for, that activities are date, time stamp, set in stone, and you reduce the amount of fraud because you can't modify or cook the books in the background. So there's no surprises here. Our outputs are hashes. We use hashes today and all sorts of things. We'll walk through that a little bit. But what we do is we change what we see in terms of what is security. And so data security now becomes cryptography. It becomes that technique of validation. And the hash is dependent on the data in that block. So everybody has to agree. And of course, these are mathematical algorithms. When I say everybody agrees to this, the mathematical algorithm is X data in your wallet is X data. And it's not that you can, exaggerate it or paint it to be something that it isn't. So blockchain takes the human part out of some of this transaction history and the written record of what is happening. So I'm going to really segue quickly over to cybersecurity, and I'm going to breeze through this just because we probably are really familiar with what this is. But the cyber in cybersecurity is electronic data. That's the same that we see in the block. So we're not talking about different kind of data or different modality of data. Electronic data, same. But the security part is what's so different, right? So here in the cybersecurity world, we have to do layers and layers of stuff because we are constantly masquerading what the real data is. So we want confidentiality, which means who is authorized to view the data at what point in time. Our data has a life cycle and we don't want people seeing it all the time. We do not want transparency at all. In fact, integrity oftentimes in our cybersecurity world is relegated to the world of development, the integrity of changing that data as it becomes an application or a coded device or tool, but not so much that integrity about changes to your Word documents or maybe how we flow information in email. We don't really worry about that kind of integrity. And then of course, availability, where data is stored, how it is moved from point A to point B, the availability of data, again, like encrypting it so it's not available to be viewed or changed or masqueraded. So we do a lot of different activities in our businesses today to make sure that the data is what the data is. And now we're just going to pivot to the research world, right? How much time do we spend trying to validate the validity of the source of data, or which could be a person, or it could be a source from, say, a database, or research from, say, articles and other things, which become digital data. And so we've got all of these efforts to kind of find out a source, but then validate that it's what it is. And it becomes very difficult. And at some times we can't even get to 100%. We just have to say, this is really qualitative data rather than substantive data because we can't quantitate what's happening because there's too much of a variation of it. So, cybersecurity is kind of our current world. It's a pretty good point of reference, but here we see that in business, data has to be classified in some way. Is it public? Is it confidential? And then based on that classification, we have to secure it. We have to wrap it into layer after layer after layer of security, because what we want with our data is no transparency. In fact, inside our business processes, we segregate who can see what part of the data. We do not want that one trusted network. We do not want independent validators. We do not trust other people and their computing power to be consistent. And then how do we validate the consistency of that third party? And so we have a lot of complexity in how we manage cybersecurity today. And the interesting thing about that, after all of these other devices, firewalls, and we've got encryption, and we've got antivirus software, we have all these things to help us make sure we have confidentiality and integrity and availability. But ironically, the #1 source of your cybersecurity compromise is human error. We just send the email to the wrong recipient. We just printed it out and threw it away and somebody picked it up. Or we saved it into a USB device and it got lost. It just happens. We are distracted, we are easily confused, or we're tired and we just do things out of sync. Well, that's not going to go away, whether you're cybersecurity world or blockchain world. And so that's the interesting part, is that we easily poke holes in the security that we put in there. Another one of that would be that we share passwords, right? We just give away the keys to our kingdom because it's convenient. And then on the blockchain side, right, we have these advantages in the business side that we could track those assets, because a block is a block and we know all of them. And I like to think of this one like if we had a fleet of cars. And every car, the source of like where all the materials are. So those, let's say around the world, we get, all the metal materials, and then certain components of that are chain activities on this block that tell us, where it was, the fenders were molded and shipped from, and, where the engine parts were molded. And then you see the country that was assembling this vehicle, and then you get to a fleet of vehicles. So your block shows a date, time, the set of vehicles, the number of vehicles, and then you could see from a commodity standpoint where you can start tracking the activity on that fleet, like what dealerships purchased and how many, and then where those are. You could even get down to, if you think of that transparency and then transaction, the number of cars that were lemons and the number of cars that worked properly based on the ability to just keep track of an asset throughout its life cycle. We love the business use of blockchain for that node validation. If you think of the state of Iowa, they figured out how to get distributed computing power very objectively validating data points. Those private keys were used, expired, and then it stops, it locks it. And then of course, how you manage all of that. Now, all of that good, right? We still have heard, experienced stories where blockchain is not impermeable. Humans are still involved. And so hacks do take place, but they're not hacking and modifying chain. I think this is the curious part about it. Bad actors aren't interested in the record of things. They're interested in the coins that were in the wallet. And so they are manipulating and misdirecting users of that blockchain to give away their private keys or somehow masquerade as them authenticating to the network. So it has our same front-end security vulnerabilities as any network. And I think that helps us relate to it. This blockchain isn't so mysterious anymore. So the good news is I'm down to my last 2 slides so that we can open it up for some good discussions on it. But now I really want to connect them all together, right? So when we see a world that has blockchain, we see that we have a lot of transparency. Every node on that network has a copy of that network. They have a copy of all the blocks, right? So the point of that computing power is that the validating computer is validating the entire network continuously. That's why it takes up so much power. One of the challenges with that is that in our current cybersecurity concept, our networks are not shared. We don't want every, if you think of commodities, we don't want all of our competitors getting an exact copy of everything that's happening on that network. We don't like that. And the other thing we don't like is that it leads us to, we can't, paint things in a nicer light than what they are, because the audit trail is set in stone and there it is. So we can't say that something was made in America when actually the blockchain shows 90% of that vehicle was, sourced outside the US and then assembled in America, right? And certain parts were literally made in America. So we lose some of this flexibility to paint something a little bit better or a little bit worse than what it is. So we're not really comfortable with transparency. If we were to take cybersecurity and put it on like a corporate HR model, right? Some of the challenges you have is like, okay, so every employee has a block and their activity, like their hire date, the access that they were granted, what they were granted access to, and maybe even performance reviews and payroll, and of course what they're paid. But if every node on that shared network has a copy of all of that, the last thing we want is 2 employees sitting next to each other and having the capability or the visibility into some of that, what we call sensitive data today. So we really are like, how are we going to take a blockchain and put it in HR? How are we going to take blockchain and put it in our municipal areas like oil, gas, electricity, or voting at the state level, or voting at the state and also the federal level, or the shares between blockchain networks, if we think about it that way, right? So we all agree, okay, a federal shared network is good, all states are nodes on it, and they're all independent validating it. All states see all identities across the US. That's reasonable because now you can connect your, state shared blockchain to the federal, and now you can validate, through all of these layers that we have. So, transparency doesn't necessarily have to be a negative. We're just not really comfortable with where that's going. But if we pivot over into the research world, think about if you're creating a blockchain network for your research. Let's say you're a university, you have a grant, you're going to do this blockchain for the security of the research and the data, but you don't want all the validators, because that's the functionality of blockchain. You don't want all the validators seeing all of the same blocks of data. You have to mask. You might have a blind test. You don't want that visible. What are you going to do with that? Or you need to validate participants, so that participant actually has to agree to having that block of data about them input into that shared network, and then trust the management of that data outside their control. Where if they were actually on a national identity shared network, they are in control of their private key. They're in control of how they're applying their approval for a smart contract or an asset or a transaction. So in the research world, you end up with, again, some of those challenges to hurdles to jump over, the usability of something or sort of its application, because you would be a one-off blockchain. And then you get to other things like the consensus by all nodes, like who owns that network. In the commodity world, they take all of the participants agree to come onto the shared network, and so they have a committee that says who is a request to be added to that blockchain network, and so they review that, and then request to be a validator, and so they review that. So it's a consensus again, but it's not one company, it's not one person, it's not one entity, and that kind of builds into why, you know, even Bitcoin is so durable. Why is it so pliable and durable? And it's been in place for what, 11 years now. And some of that durability comes in because it's not dependent on one individual, one company, or one organization. It has this consensus there. And so you end up with a whole different way of looking at creating digital data, managing the life cycle of that data, and then how do you apply it at like that commodity level? How would you bring it down to, say, a national level? How would you bring it down again to a regional level? Could you use it even at your company level? And, you know, to take the abstract out of it, the state of Iowa is a perfect example of that, where they said, here's our state blockchain network. This is how we add residents. This is how we add businesses. This is how we use a resident to do a private key to do a transaction. This is how they have cyber currency. And, you know, they can open their wallet and take a piece of the currency off, and that's how they pay for their light bill, and another piece off, and that's how they pay for their gas bill, and then their employer gives them Bitcoin or fills their wallet up. And we see this now, same thing, just take it out of the blockchain network and bring it local. Some companies do payroll on a card. They fund the card, not your bank account. So it's interesting how we are pretty comfortable with digital currency, or getting money without actually physically touching money, or getting services without a paper contract. And you can now see how you could extrapolate into the business model some of the advantages of blockchain, because some of these contracts can be set up in that shared network, and as a consumer of that, you can come in and then you have this kind of transparency in all the transactions of all of that and what's happening. Okay, and so we're just going to wrap up here with the last two about blockchain. The immutability of that is that it's encrypted and you can't modify what's happened. In the research world, that's great because you have a high reliability of it. And depending on the type of research you're doing, that is actually what would get you meeting all of your criteria to get either additional funding or to approve publication. So you've got a way for transparency in your industry for the research and the validity of it. As you can imagine, there's a lot of internal fuzzy stuff that happens with that. And that's why cybersecurity has so much complexity around it. You have to have operating systems that are secure, and your operating system could be your laptop, or it could be your company's network, or wherever your research sources are. And you might have within your own research organization competition. So you don't want, you know, you're both racing to find the cure for something. You don't want them to see your research, your even restricting connectivity and transparency from that. How we move data, how we encrypt data. I mean, currently in our cybersecurity world, we have a whole lot of industries that have come up around the fact that we do so much security through obscurity, that, like the legal industry, prove intent, prove accountability, prove the date and time that things happened. And because so much of our data is squishy, I mean, it's not written hard. You can modify, even if it's written in backup and encrypted off-site located somewhere, you could potentially restore the backup, modify it, and resave it. You could potentially change date times on it. I mean, there isn't a lot of immutability about how we use data today. And of course, that's why the bad actors are so successful at getting cybersecurity breaches and compromises, because again, 50% of this security is up to us, right? If we share things, we accidentally lose things, and that's part of the lack of immutability in our current data management. And I'm sure from a research standpoint, you can think about what percentage of your time is spent to protect or defend the information that you have, or the source of information you have. Imagine from a research perspective as well, if you're trying to get participants on your research, you have to confirm who they are. And we take a lot of trust, like we introduce each other, and you've done nothing to see what I look like, validate that I really am Kate Riley or this Kate Riley, and how I'm engaging in this, right? And so we have a lot of that in that 50% of human error part, where we really don't know our sources of data and information, because in some cases you have no reasonable way to validate who is who. And so we start to see where blockchain has some of this usability in how we want to get immutability and, of course, get that independence and durability of how data is being collected but also managed. And then we're just going to wrap up a hash total. So if you think about blockchain, the ingenious part of it is that block of data. Everybody knows what that block of data is. Hash total is been around forever. And so it's not like this tricky science or mathematical model that people have to figure out in order to use blockchain. So the good news here is you start to look at, we all have an understanding of what our research data is. That's the block. And then that quantitative value becomes a hash. That's the encryption part of it. If I were to go in and modify, if you will, the coins in my wallet, that hash value isn't going to match anymore. There has been an addition or a subtraction. In some cases, if you just open the wallet, that's a transaction because it says somebody peeked. A viewing is a condition of the contract. Who is reading this, right? And so then you've got a validation because that activity happened, and we recognize from a mathematical standpoint what those activities are. So it becomes possible for us to actually measure change in data, very independent from the person that says, I didn't save that file there, I didn't send that file over there. Right now in our cybersecurity world, we move data which absolutely loses the security in it. As soon as I attach a file to an email, it may not be encrypted anymore. My email may not be encrypted. When I press go, the receiver may not save it encrypted. If we monitor, the activities of stuff, we're logging my activities, and those are hash totals, right? Those logs come into what's called a SIEM, a security information and event manager. And what it's doing is comparing hash totals for predictability of, is this a bad actor? Is this malware? Is this legitimate? So it's ironic how we do a lot of mirroring of what we like about blockchain security in our current world without success of immutability, process integrity, or even consistency, because we are not encrypting everything along the way. And the other kind of thing to compare here from the hash totals and the immutability is that's all computing power. Imagine if you were to have your regular corporate network and you've got your systems in cloud systems and you've got log management, and now you're going to create a blockchain trusted network. You start to have, you're starting to split hairs, if you will. Like, how do you keep up with a blockchain network? Because that's distributed and independent and shared, and you're not in control of it. And from a compliance standpoint, how do you prove that every validator is every validator? How do you prove that the consensus to who is added to your network is a consumer node versus a computing power validation node? And so you get some of these, conflicting messages, like, how do I apply this? And, you almost want to say, how did the state of Iowa figure out just to say, okay, all new businesses will be blockchain? They create the network first, they create the models, they get the early adopters, and then you kind of work out the rest of it. So it's kind of, cool to see there are a lot of actually great functions and uses in blockchain, but we do have some of our, current cybersecurity insecurities and how we would apply it. So, so that's really all I wanted to do today, is just kind of take the mystique out of blockchain, connect to what we have in terms of how we're using cybersecurity today, maybe how we would apply it either to a research model or even to a current business model. So I'm going to open it up and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Kate, so much for that. That was fantastic. I've sat in a good number of sessions about blockchain, and I always leave with a whole bunch more questions. And you answered a lot of those for me today personally, so I really appreciate that. If you guys have any questions, please shoot them into the chat functionality of the GoToWebinar frame there on your screen. One question that I did have, if people are compiling some questions for you, Kate, one of the big things around blockchain that make it, one of the the big advantages of it includes this third party, verification and quality control process. I know
Yeah.
you talked a little bit about it, but does each, how are those established really? And are they, you know, does each person kind of do their own, or is it all just models that are based within the blockchain? Or, you know,
It's
do you have some ability to set your own, or how does that process work?
So
If
an
that
example, that's
question
a
even makes sense.
wonderful question. So an example is, let's say you and I are going to create our blockchain network. And so we create our network, and in our network, because this is all calculating based on the value of a block of data. So part of building that network is building in the models of what the blocks are, because that's a functionality. So the easiest way to translate that would be, you have a wallet. And in your wallet, let's say we're the state of Iowa, in the wallet, we've got ID, so our name, and that calculates to a value. And we've got address or money. And so we all agree when we create what a block is and how we add data to it, how the block value creates a hash total. Now that's an algorithm, so that's software. And so that's how we create the network. Now we say we want independent nodes attached to that network. A node is just a computer or a server. And what we want the job of that node to do is get a copy of all of those blocks and recalculate those hash totals 24/7. That's all it does. It's not a person, it's a computer. It's attached to it. And the computer's own purpose is to process that calculation and return the value of that block was 6, now that block is 10, that block was 10, and now that block is 4. That's all it's doing based on what the consumer's doing on that, which is that public-private key thing saying, ooh, I want to create a contract with you to rent my home. Here's my payment for the rent. Or I want to consume services like power. And so as you imagine, those nodes are computing powers independent. They don't actually, it's a computer. It doesn't know who's doing what, right? It has no subjectivity to like, oh, that's Kate in that house. You know, let's give her a break on the power bill today. Can't even happen that way, because the node is just an algorithm computer. Now, why do you get independence of that? Is because as people request to be added to our shared network, we are a committee of people, not just you saying, yes, let's add Kate to this network, or no. It's a consensus thing. And so you think about it, you've got to have somebody in our core shared network that's managing the requests to add to our network, or be removed from the network, or become a validator on our network or not. Now, we understand data mining and validation in the Bitcoin world the best, because in order to get independent validation, they had to give an incentive for somebody to allow all of that consumption of computing power, because it's not, you know, it's not a few things. Imagine it just takes, it's 24/7. It takes a really long time. The bigger your network, the more complex those transactions to get to that validation of computing of it. So they needed to have enough people globally so they weren't dependent on any region or any certain type of computing power. That created the durability. But when they got to a certain level or number of validations, they would give them some Bitcoin as a reward for their services, which is why a lot of people will steal your computing power to do Bitcoin mining in the back end. And so that's actually a thing. But that's some of the complexity, is like, okay, so it's our private Bitcoin network, and we're not going to have a committee doing this. We're going to have subjective nodes, because we're just going to pop up a lot of different servers in our own little corporate world, and we're just going to configure those servers to do the computing power. So they're going to consume, you know, power and resources to do the computing power, but we are just absolutely in control of it. Now, is that bit change? Sure, it is, because of the functionality of adding and moving and the blocks of data and how we set up the security and the functionality of that software. So that's why that works so well. Is it, if you think about it going to like a national level, you start to see where it's so complex, because you have hundreds of millions of people that you've got to have more than a entity or a certain number of resources managing that network. A network is a network. So it becomes more, let's get consensus. And like with the diamond industry, it's all of the diamond mining companies agreed to create the blockchain network. If you're not on the blockchain, doesn't mean that you can't buy and sell diamonds. It means you don't have as much integrity in the diamonds that you're trying to sell. And now some of the purchasers of these diamonds are like, no, if it's not from the blockchain, I don't trust it. So it created this and lended itself into that. So imagine you're a commodity and you want to get onto the blockchain for diamonds. You have to be validated by this committee before they'll give you your ID and your block on the blockchain network. And so that's why you get this public and private key component to it. So it can grow that way.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. So thank you for taking that through me, Kate. And so, in your mind, where you see this rolling out and continuing, it's going to be more around industries or companies or groups of people, organizations where they create their own blockchain. Do you ever see a scenario where, I mean, I guess it would have to be government, functionality, national, like on a national level, where everyone would get on some type of a blockchain. You talked a little bit about Iowa and voting from a government perspective, but that's always been kind of a thing that I, struggled with on what would be the advantage of me as just an individual person in the world to get onto the blockchain. But it doesn't sound like there's some like universal blockchain on that you just get into. It'd be for a specific reason, so that you can like get utilities for your team, or for your organization, for you to be able to access the systems. You have to be, verified on blockchain or what have you. Is that the right way of thinking it? Like the research industry could decide to do blockchain as a way to verify, people that are providing respondents?
Well, definitely. And I think to make a cultural shift from what we're so familiar with, states having the local rights of residents versus giving up that right to be part of a federal blockchain network because of the control, right? Or that our federal government would agree, like, could we get consensus at a federal level to create a national blockchain? Like, then we've got all of that political infighting, like who gets to drive it, who's a validator, who's a consumer. I think right now, just from a cultural standpoint, we just aren't at the maturity level of trusting each other to handle the politics of identity and identity management. What's so interesting in that argument, though, is that when we first got to the network, nobody trusted the network. Remember ATM cards? Who would trust putting digital money on a credit card and get paid, or make your grocery paid with an ATM card? That just seemed so conceptually unsafe, unsecure. Do you remember when cell phones came out? It tells you how old I am. You used to drive without a phone, and now you feel so unsecure without a phone in you in the car. So from a cultural standpoint, I think we're headed into this idea where we don't need obscurity to protect my identity. In fact, I get more bandwidth out of having a public key that people know that this is the exact Kate Riley that you're talking to. I don't expect to have that confidential. My social is my social is my social. It doesn't give you any power. What gives the power is when I apply my private key to a transaction based on whatever blockchain network I choose to belong to. So, eventually I think we're going to get to a comfort level on how we have a public use of block and a private consumer matching, like pieces in a puzzle that put together, and then how the consumer ends up with more control over that. And as you can imagine now, businesses want to persuade and sort of manipulate the perception of value. And so with a blockchain having a lot of transparency and everybody on that block having the ability to have a copy of it to do validation, or, obscure some of the transactions to it, it's very difficult to see, like, how are we going to take this big leap? How can I step from what I'm comfortable with to what I'm uncomfortable with? But I think you're right. I think it's like researchers coming up with the idea and then trying it out on a blockchain network. And seeing how it works on a micro level, and then at a kind of a bigger macro level. And I'm sure the state of Iowa didn't start out with the whole state and all residents. They probably started out with something that was very consumable, like a commodity, like power, and very easy, because in order to, at your home, you have a connection to that shared network already. From a digital standpoint, it's reading your power consumption, and somebody walks around and says that's how much power you have. Imagine taking that and putting it in a digital concept. So I think it's just translating it into, manageable bites and pieces that we can make functional. But I always think it's easier on a small scale and then bring it to the big scale. I would also say this, my closing comment here. We already do a lot of this already. Think of the smart contracts. You know, again, we have a lot of condition algorithms in software that already does this for us. It's just not a shared network that we have a private key to have transparency in. And we do this with a lot of our smart property. Your iPhone has a device on your door. Your phone will open and close your door. It'll lock your door. It'll tell you somebody's trying to open your door. So we have a lot of the blockchain already in place. It's just not ubiquitous and it's not familiar. But I think eventually it will be. It's cost effective. If you imagine, in a lot of ways, it's a lot more secure than our current management of data.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Kate. Thank you so much. It doesn't look like we have any other questions really coming through. Kate, I expect that this is a lot of information, and we're continuing to evolve our understanding on blockchain, and obviously cybersecurity is something that's important to all of us, just as general consumers. And then certainly in our business as well. So I definitely know that this conversation is going to continue to evolve, and we'll very excited to see how it has an impact on our business as well. So thank you so much for your time, Kate. Really, really appreciate it. With that, I thank you to our sponsor of this event, Focus Vision. If your firm is interested in partnering with our chapter, we'd love to hear from you. Or if you'd like to volunteer, please reach out. As well, as I mentioned, please save the date for our next event in our quarterly webinar series, which will be on June 17th, where we learn more about creating communications for impact. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that all of you, as members of the Insights Association, will get a complimentary attendance and registration for the next conference, the NEXT conference that's being held June 1st through 3rd. So please make sure that if you haven't registered for that you go and do it today. I know it's going to be a great learning event for us all, and the fact that we get to join in complimentary is certainly a huge advantage. So thank you guys. Thank you, Kate. Thank all of you for joining us today. We will send out a recording after it gets published. I hope you all found this as helpful as I did, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.